A struggling single father gave away his last sandwich to a Hells Angels member he found sitting alone on the street, not knowing how this one act of kindness would change everything. 3 days later, when Marcus could barely scrape together dinner for his 2 young children, the thunderous roar of 6 Harley-Davidsons pulled up outside his apartment building. But what happens when the most feared biker gang in America decides to repay a debt of kindness? The late afternoon sun filtered through the grimy windows of downtown storefronts, casting amber light across sidewalks cracked like broken promises, where the scent of exhaust fumes mingled with the distant aroma of coffee from a corner deli that Marcus couldn't afford to visit anymore. He walked slowly, his work boots worn thin at the heels, each step a careful calculation between getting home to his kids and making this moment last just a little longer before facing the empty refrigerator that waited like an accusation in their tiny kitchen. The weight of the brown paper bag in his calloused hands felt both precious and pathetic. 2 slices of day-old bread, generic peanut butter spread thin as hope, wrapped in a napkin he'd saved from the diner, where he used to take Sophie and David on better days, back when payday meant celebration instead of careful rationing. The city moved around him with the indifferent rhythm of a machine that had no time for individual struggles. Buses belching diesel smoke as they carried people to jobs that paid enough for real groceries, for restaurants, for the luxury of choosing what to eat instead of eating what you could afford. Marcus remembered when he'd been one of those people, when middle age didn't feel like a burden, when his reflection in store windows showed a man with purpose instead of this hollow-eyed stranger who counted quarters for bus fare and calculated whether walking home would save enough money to buy milk that wasn't about to expire. His wedding ring, the one piece of jewelry he refused to pawn no matter how desperate things got, caught the light as he shifted the paper bag, and he could almost hear Sarah's voice, reminding him that kindness was never wasted, that giving from an empty hand meant more than giving from abundance, that their children were watching him navigate this disaster and learning what kind of man their father really was beneath the surface of his struggles. Marcus paused outside the old brick building where shadows gathered like secrets, and that's when he saw him, a mountain of a man in black leather, sitting against the wall, with his back straight and his eyes fixed on a point far beyond the cracked asphalt. The Hells Angels patches on his vest caught the dying light, serpents and skulls embroidered with the kind of precision that spoke of brotherhood, of belonging to something larger than yourself, and Marcus felt a strange kinship with that need, even as his pulse quickened with instinctive wariness. The biker's weathered hands rested on his knees, fingers stained with motor oil and decorated with silver rings that had seen too many fights, too many long nights on empty highways, and his stillness held a quality that reminded Marcus of his own father during those final months, when pride was all that kept a man upright, even as everything else fell apart. The stranger's lined face told stories of hard living, with creases carved deep around eyes that were distant and searching, holding memories of highways that stretched beyond horizons, of brotherhood forged in metal and machinery, of choices that led away from conventional safety into a rawness and honesty that most people couldn't handle. When those eyes met Marcus's gaze, there was no threat there, only a weariness that recognized itself in another soul, the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying burdens alone, from fighting battles that nobody else understands, from learning that the world judges by appearance rather than heart, and finding yourself on the wrong side of those judgments more often than not. Rough day? Marcus found himself asking, though he'd intended to walk past, to mind his own business, like every survival instinct screamed at him to do. But something in the biker's posture called to the part of him that Sarah had always loved best, the part that saw people instead of problems, that reached out instead of walking away. The biker's laugh was dry as desert wind, carrying decades of disappointment and hard-won wisdom. Rough life, he replied, and Marcus heard the echo of his own thoughts in those two simple words. Recognize the weight of trying to hold yourself together when everything keeps falling apart, of maintaining dignity when the world seems determined to strip it away piece by piece. The paper bag crinkled in Marcus's grip as he shifted his weight from one worn boot to the other, the ache of missing meals that had become a constant companion, cramping his abdomen these past few months. Ever since the layoffs at the factory, since medical bills from Sophie's pneumonia had eaten through their savings like acid through metal, since he'd learned that being a good man and a hard worker meant nothing when economic forces beyond his control decided his job was expendable. "You look like you could use this more than me," Marcus said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice as he extended the sandwich, this small offering that represented his lunch and dinner, and maybe breakfast too, if he was being honest about their situation. The biker stared at the wrapped sandwich as if it were some foreign object, an item he couldn't quite process or trust, and Marcus understood that look because he'd worn it himself in the unemployment office, at the food bank, every time someone tried to help, and he had to swallow his pride as broken glass. "Name's Tank?" the stranger said finally, accepting the sandwich with hands that could crush bone, but held the simple meal like spun gold, like the first kindness he'd received in longer than he cared to remember. "Marcus," he replied, then turned to walk away before the gesture could become complicated. Before Tank could ask questions, Marcus didn't know how to answer. Before the familiar pang of deprivation could make him second-guess this decision both foolish and necessary, like feeding your last grain of rice to a sparrow when winter is coming and you don't know where your next meal will come from. The 20-minute walk home felt longer than usual, each step weighted with the memory of Tank's grateful expression. Marcus's apartment building stood like a tired sentinel against the evening sky, its brick facade stained with decades of city rain and broken dreams, the kind of place where neighbors learned not to ask too many questions and children grew up fast or not at all. He climbed the narrow stairs to the third floor, each step echoing through hallways that smelled of cooking oil and industrial disinfectant, the gnawing hollow in his gut growing more insistent as he fumbled for keys that seemed heavier in his pocket every day. The sound of cartoons drifted through the thin door of apartment 3B, and Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, steeling himself for the performance he'd perfected over these lean months. The smile that said everything was fine, the voice that promised better days were coming, the father who could somehow stretch love into sustenance when the cupboards ran bare. "Daddy?" Sophie launched herself into his arms before he'd fully stepped inside, her small body warm and trusting against his chest, her dark hair smelling of the cheap shampoo they bought by the gallon at the discount store. At 8, she still believed her father could fix anything, solve any problem, make any hurt disappear with the right combination of hugs and promises, and Marcus held her tight enough to memorize the feeling, because he knew that faith wouldn't last forever. Not in a world that taught children about scarcity before they learned to tie their shoes. David looked up from his homework at the kitchen table, 10 years old, but wearing the careful expression of someone much older, someone who'd learned to read the tension in his father's shoulders, the forced cheerfulness in his voice, the way money conversations stopped when children entered the room. "How was work, Dad?" David asked, and Marcus heard the real question underneath. "Did you get paid today? Will we eat tonight? Are we going to be okay?" Because David remembered when they'd lived in the house with the blue shutters and the backyard where they'd grilled hamburgers on Sundays, before his mother got sick, before the medical bills and the funeral costs, and the slow slide into this existence where every dollar had to be stretched until it screamed. "It was good, buddy," Marcus replied, opening the refrigerator to stare at its sparse contents, a carton of milk with 2 days left on the expiration date, some leftover rice from yesterday, half a jar of peanut butter that would have to last until next payday, a can of green beans that could make 3 servings if he was creative enough with seasoning and optimism. The weight of Tank's grateful look pressed against Marcus's conscience as he stood in the pale light of the refrigerator, his reflection ghosted in the white surface. And he wondered what kind of man gives away food his children need. What kind of father chooses a stranger's hunger over his own family's security? But then he remembered the emptiness in Tank's steel-gray eyes, that particular kind of defeat that comes not from losing everything, but from believing you don't deserve anything better. And Marcus knew he'd made the only choice his heart would let him live with. "What's for dinner?" Sophie asked from the living room, her voice bright with the assumption that dinner was a given, that fathers always found a way, that love was enough to fill empty stomachs and quiet the growling that kept her awake some nights. Marcus closed the refrigerator door and turned to face his children, these two perfect beings who trusted him to be their whole world, their safety net, their promise that tomorrow would be better than today. "How about we make it an adventure?" he said, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands as he reached for the can opener, began planning how to turn rice and beans into a feast, how to make scarcity feel like abundance, how to keep believing in his own ability to protect them from a world that seemed determined to prove that good men finish last, that kindness is a luxury poor people can't afford, that sometimes love isn't enough to pay the rent or fill the refrigerator or quiet the voice that whispers, "You're failing them. You're failing them. You're failing them with every empty meal, every unpaid bill, every night you lie awake, calculating how long you can keep this up before something has to give." 3 days passed as a slow burn through Marcus's carefully rationed hope, each meal a masterclass in creative desperation, as he stretched rice and beans into elaborate stories about exotic cuisines, turned water soup into clear broth adventures, and watched his children's faces for signs that his performance was finally wearing thin. The morning sun streamed through their apartment windows, illuminating dust motes that danced as tiny spirits over furniture that had seen better decades, and Marcus sat at the kitchen table, staring at bills that multiplied as bacteria in a petri dish, rent notice printed on pink paper that meant business, utility warnings that promised darkness, medical statements that read like accusations written in numbers too large to comprehend. His coffee cup held only hot water and wishful thinking, but he cradled it like salvation anyway, letting the warmth seep through his palms, while he calculated how many days they could survive on what remained in their nearly empty pantry. The rumble started low and distant, like thunder rolling across autumn fields, but this was autumn in the city where storms came with different warnings, different dangers that made mothers pull their children close, and old men remember wars they'd tried to forget. Marcus felt the vibration through the floorboards first, a bass note that seemed to rise from the earth itself, then through the walls as the sound grew closer, more distinct, separating into individual engines that spoke of polished metal and gleaming pipes, and men who'd chosen freedom over safety, rebellion over comfort. Sophie pressed her face against the living room window, her breath fogging the glass as she counted the motorcycles that appeared around the corner like a scene from a movie she wasn't old enough to watch, their riders' dark silhouettes against the pale afternoon sky that suddenly felt too small to contain what was coming. "Dad?" David's voice carried a tremor that made Marcus's protective instincts flare like struck matches, and he moved to the window where his children stood transfixed by the sight of 6 Harley-Davidsons arranged in perfect formation outside their building, their chrome catching light in brilliant flashes, their riders dismounting with the kind of synchronized precision that spoke of brotherhood, forged in highways and honky-tonks and places where ordinary rules didn't apply. Tank stepped forward from the group, his massive frame unmistakable even from 3 floors up, and Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs in desperate rhythm, because this was his neighborhood, his building, his children's safe space, being invaded by a world he'd touched only briefly, with a sandwich and a moment's kindness that now seemed reckless beyond measure. "Stay inside," Marcus told his children, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from pure parental terror, disguised as calm instruction. But Sophie was already asking questions. Who are they, Daddy? Why are they here? Are we in trouble? While David moved protectively closer to his sister, 10 years old, but already understanding that sometimes adults made choices that brought consequences crashing down on innocent heads. The sound of boots on stairs echoed through the building as a countdown, heavy and deliberate, accompanied by the jingle of chains and the creak of leather, filling every empty space with possibility and threat in equal measure. And Marcus found himself standing at his door, with his hand on the deadbolt, listening to his own breathing, his own heartbeat, his own whispered prayer that whatever was coming, his children would be safe. The knock came soft as a question, almost gentle, 3 precise raps that somehow carried more weight than any angry pounding could have managed. And Marcus opened the door to find Tank standing in the hallway, with 5 other riders behind him, their road-worn features, mapping journeys traveled, and prices paid, their eyes holding that particular mix of respect and determination that made Marcus understand this wasn't about intimidation or collection or any of the dark scenarios his mind had conjured during the long walk down 3 flights of stairs. "You probably don't remember me," Tank said, his voice bearing the rough tenderness of a man who'd learned that kindness was a language few people bothered to speak fluently. But Marcus remembered everything. The steel-gray eyes, the careful way Tank had held that sandwich, the hollow look of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen as human rather than threat, and suddenly the hallway felt too small to contain what was about to happen between them. The grocery bags seemed to multiply like loaves and fishes in a miracle. Marcus's childhood Sunday school memories couldn't quite process. Each paper sack carried with the reverence of men who understood hunger not as abstraction, but as lived experience. As nights when your stomach keeps you awake and your pride keeps you from asking for help. As the particular shame that comes from wanting something as basic as food and not knowing how to make it happen. Tank moved through Marcus's small kitchen with surprising gentleness for such a massive man, his rings clicking softly against cans and boxes as he arranged provisions that transformed the space from bare necessity into genuine abundance. Real milk that wasn't watered down, bread that wasn't day-old, meat that didn't require creative seasoning to mask the flavor of desperation, fruits that still held the memory of sunshine and rain and better times. Sophie crept closer with each item that appeared, her 8-year-old wonder overriding her caution, as she watched these black-clad figures fill their empty cupboards with the kind of plenty she'd nearly forgotten existed, her small fingers reaching out to touch a bag of red apples, as if they might disappear if she breathed too hard, while David maintained his protective distance until Tank knelt down to meet him at eye level, his battle-scarred visage softening into a quality that could have been grandfatherly if grandfathers wore serpent tattoos and Hell's Angels patches. "Your dad's a good man, kid," Tank said, his voice holding decades of highway wisdom and hard-earned truth. "Real good men are rare as honest mechanics and twice as valuable. So you remember that when the world tries to tell you different, when people judge by appearances instead of actions, when someone shows you kindness without expecting payment in return." The other riders worked in practiced silence, their movements efficient and purposeful, as they transformed Marcus's kitchen from empty promise into fulfilled hope, each man contributing to this choreography of giving that seemed as natural to them as breathing, as writing, as taking care of their own, in a world that had taught them early that family wasn't always about blood, but sometimes about choice, about recognition, about seeing yourself in another person's struggle and deciding to do something about it. Marcus stood in his own doorway, feeling like a stranger in his transformed home, overwhelmed by the generosity that kept flowing from paper bags and cardboard boxes, by the casual way these men treated miracle-making, by the realization that his small act of sandwich sharing had somehow rippled outward into this moment, too overwhelming for his chest to contain. "Nobody's ever given me something and walked away without wanting something back," Tank said as his brothers filed toward the door, their work complete, their obligation fulfilled, their heavy boots echoing through the hallway that had absorbed this strange visitation as a sponge absorbs water, making it part of the building's history, part of the story these walls would tell, long after current tenants moved on to other struggles, other miracles, other moments, when strangers became family through the simple act of seeing each other's humanity. Nobody, Tank repeated, his weathered eyes, the color of winter sky, holding Marcus's gaze with the intensity of someone making a promise, sharing a truth, passing along wisdom earned through lifetimes of learning that the world was divided not between good people and bad people, but between those who helped and those who hurt, those who gave and those who took, those who recognized suffering and those who walked past it without a second glance. The sound of motorcycles starting filled the evening air like a benediction, 6 engines harmonizing into a song of departure that conveyed gratitude and respect and the particular kind of peace that comes from debts paid and kindness answered. Somewhere in the vast machinery of urban indifference, human connection still sparked across the artificial boundaries of class and appearance and assumption. Marcus stood on his front steps with Sophie, and David pressed against his sides, their small bodies warm with security he hadn't been able to provide in months, watching taillights disappear into the dusk like red stars fading into purple sky. And for the first time since his wife's funeral, since the layoffs began, since pride became a luxury he couldn't afford, the empty feeling in his chest had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the overwhelming fullness of unexpected grace. Discovering brotherhood in the least likely place, learning that sometimes the angels who save us wear leather wings and ride steel horses and appear exactly when hope is running on fumes and faith is down to its last match.